Some people say they read the obituaries to make sure their name isn't listed. I read the obituaries because I love newspapers and I love good stories. Several years ago, I was teaching a class and I asked the participants to write their own obit as if it were a Twitter tweet. Back then it was 140 characters, including spaces. I passed out 3x5 cards. I gave everyone number 2 pencils. And you know what? The class just sat there. They couldn't write a thing. It reminded me of a story, a short story written by one of my favorite writers, Tobias Wolff, called Mortals. It's about a young newspaper man who's called into his editor's office one day. Standing there is an old gent, and his editor says, "This is Mr. Ronald Givens. Name ring a bell? I'll give you a hint. He's not dead." You see, without checking the funeral home or the family, he had posted an obituary for someone who was still alive. The young journalist is fired on the spot. As he walks out the building carrying in a box the contents of his desk, he sees the old gent on the street, Mr. Ronald Givens. "Let me at least buy you lunch," says the older man. "I feel sorry for you getting fired." As they sit in the steakhouse, they talk about who in the world might have called in this false obituary. And then Ronald says, "When you were writing, did you get any idea for the kind of man I was? The kind of man who served his country in the time of war, the kind of man who would stay with one woman for 42 years, who worked a steady job." "A light bulb came on," said the young journalist. "How could I have been such a dim bulb?" He said, "You wrote your own obituary. You called in the obituary, didn't you?" And Mr. Givens says one single word, "Yes." Well, if you had to write your obituary, what would you say? I'm fond of quoting a columnist from the Times, a guy named David Brooks, who says there are 2 kinds of values in life. You have resume values, and then you have what he calls eulogy or obituary values. Now, resume values are the kind of things that you put on your resume, of course, what kind of jobs you've held, what kind of service you've done, the places you went to college, how you scrambled up the ladder of success. And that's all good and fine. But when it comes to your funeral, then you have obituary values. That is, what do people say? What do people write about the kind of person you were? Were you a kind parent? Were you a loving spouse? Were you a generous friend? Were you devoted to your children? Did you care for people who were on the margins of society? Because those are the things that truly value. I wonder if we had to think about what kind of obituary we would write, what would we include? There's a story in the New Testament about a vineyard. Here we go again with the vineyards. About a vineyard. A man owns a vineyard. And when it's at the end of this season, he sends a servant to collect the rent, or at least a share of the profits. Well, the workers in the vineyard see the servant coming and, well, they give him a good beating and send him on his way. The owner of the vineyard sends another servant to collect the rent. And this time, they beat him even more harshly and send him packing. Now finally, the vineyard owner says, "I'm going to send my son this time because certainly they're going to respect my son." He sends his son, and when the workers see the young man coming, they say to themselves, "Here comes the owner's son. Let's kill him and take the vineyard for himself." And they dump his body outside the city gates. Well, in our lives, we have the choice between what kind of values we want to live by. Do we want to live by resume values or obituary values? What causes have we given ourselves to? What great ideas do we follow? Are we more concerned about what we have achieved or what people will say to us and about us once we're gone? I was reading an obituary here many years ago about a federal judge named Albert P. Tuttle. I had never heard of him, and perhaps you never have either, until I read his obituary. They asked Judge Tuttle what jurisprudence experience caused you to be such a devoted champion of equal rights and people on the margins of society. And he told a simple story. One summer's day, he was on the porch with his mother snapping peas. They saw a housekeeper, an African-American woman, who worked for one of the neighbors, walk past her house, go to the corner, and wait for a bus. The bus came, but didn't stop. It wasn't full. Another bus came, also not full. It didn't stop either, and another and another. They wouldn't stop because they saw a black woman wearing house cleaner's clothing. Albert says his mother got up, went to the house, and put on her hat and gloves, like a good Southern lady of the time. That she put her pocketbook under her arm and walked to the corner to the bus stop. The first bus that came by, it stopped. She was a white woman. But she didn't get on. She allowed the housekeeper to get on the bus, and then she turned and walked back to the porch, took off her hat and gloves, started snapping peas again, all without a word. And Judge Tuttle said, it was the most profound experience of my life. Maybe you feel like your obituary's already written. There's nothing new to add to your life. You've done everything that you could do, and, well, you've missed all the other chances to do anything else. But you know, in baseball, some of the most exciting innings come in the 7th, 8th, or 9th inning. And in football, sometimes the most exciting part of the game is the 4th quarter. And have you ever been reading a book and the final chapters are the ones that just entrance you? Or have you ever watched a movie and turned it off with 20 minutes left to go? No, we wouldn't do that, because that's the best part. And it can be the best part of our lives too. Our obituaries aren't written quite yet. We still have a lot of life and living and loving to do. I remember Rabbi Kushner saying he had an experience where he had to do a funeral for a young girl, a lifeguard who had been abducted and then murdered. And it was 3 years before they found her body. And he stood before the congregation of friends and family, and he said to them, I imagine that many of you are asking, how can we go out into a world where things like this happened? And he reminded them of the dozens and dozens of people who searched for this young girl, the hours and hours they devoted to finding her, the many cards and letters that were written to the family, the concern and prayers that they showed them. One man did evil, said the rabbi, but 500 people were devoting to helping. That is a world I can live in. One day, God is going to walk past your house and stand at the corner, and it will be the test of yourself, your truest self, your best self, whether you will get up and go stand with him, because that's the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of world which will someday write our obituaries.